The woman was 41 years old, and she owned, in the whole of the world, $11 and a carpetbag. Eleanor Winslow had been cast out of the only home she had ever known by Cyrus Pruitt, chairman of the Briars Fork School Board, who accused her of stealing from the very children she had taught for 12 years, a lie built to cover his own hand in the till. With her last coins, she did something the whole town would call foolish for years afterward. She walked into a dusty land auction and paid $9 for the collapsed, condemned old schoolhouse at the edge of town, the one whose roof had caved in during a storm 5 winters past, the one nobody else would touch with a 10-foot pole. They laughed at her right there on the courthouse steps. They did not know that sealed inside the leaning bell tower, wrapped in oilcloth, and waiting patiently through years of rain and silence, rested a promise made by a teacher who had died believing no one would ever find it. A promise that would not only save Eleanor Winslow, but would save the whole forgotten town that had thrown her away. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Winslow. If you're watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know you're there. Eleanor had been born in Briars Fork, Montana Territory. In the spring of 1846, the only daughter of a blacksmith named Amos Hale, a broad, quiet man who believed that nothing in this world was truly ruined, only misunderstood. He mended what other men threw away: bent nails, cracked wheel rims, harness buckles gone brittle with rust, and he raised his daughter to see the same way, to look twice at a thing before deciding it was worthless. When Eleanor was 7, her father brought her, patched dress and all, to the one-room schoolhouse at the edge of town, where a spinster teacher named Agatha Vane taught the children of ranchers and miners and shopkeepers their letters on slates so old the frames had been mended more than once. Miss Vane took one look at young Eleanor, sitting very straight with her hands folded, and seemed to recognize something of herself in the girl. She kept Eleanor after lessons some afternoons, not out of punishment, but out of quiet devotion, teaching her long division by lamplight, and reading her passages from books the other children never saw. It was Agatha Vane who planted in Eleanor the notion that education was not a luxury handed down to the fortunate, but a debt owed to every child regardless of the coins in his father's pocket. Agatha used to say, in her dry, unhurried way, that a schoolhouse was the one building in town that ought never to close, not for war nor drought, nor the pride of any man, because a child who missed his letters at 7 rarely found his way back to them at 17. Eleanor grew into a young woman of steady hands and steadier convictions. And when she was 19, she took over as assistant teacher when Agatha's eyes began to fail her. She learned to keep ledgers of tuition and supply money down to the penny, to stretch a barrel of chalk through 2 winters, to mend a broken slate frame the way her father had taught her to mend a hinge. In 1868, she married Thomas Winslow, a homesteader with sun-cracked hands and an easy laugh, and though the town expected her to leave teaching for a farmhouse and children of her own, she never fully did, splitting her days between the schoolroom and the fields, because by then, Agatha Vane had grown too frail to climb the schoolhouse steps at all, and someone had to carry the promise forward. Agatha died in the winter of 1874, in the small room behind the schoolhouse where she had lived for 30 years, and Eleanor was the one who sat with her at the end, holding her spotted, papery hand, while the old woman murmured something about the bell tower that Eleanor, grieving and exhausted, did not think to ask more about. There was a funeral attended by half the town, because even those who had grumbled about school taxes over the years understood, in the marrow of things, what Agatha Vane had given them. Eleanor took over the schoolhouse fully after that, teaching the same lessons in the same room, ringing the same bell every morning at 8, believing she was simply continuing a life's work, rather than standing, unknowingly, at the edge of a secret. Thomas and Eleanor never had children of their own, a sorrow they carried quietly, but Eleanor came to think of every pupil who passed through her door as something like family, and the town, for all its rough edges, seemed to agree, for a time, that the schoolhouse and its patched-together teacher were simply part of the bones of Briars Fork, as permanent as the mountains that ringed it. That permanence was the very thing that made her fall, when it came, so bewildering and so complete. The fall began the way most quiet ruins do, with a man who smiled too easily. Cyrus Pruitt arrived in Briars Fork in 1880 with a lumber fortune made further east and a hunger for respectability that no fortune alone could satisfy. He bought his way onto the school board within 2 years, promising the town a proper brick schoolhouse to replace the old wooden one, and the town, dazzled by his talk of progress, elected him chairman by a wide margin. Eleanor welcomed him at first, glad of anyone who wanted to invest in the children's future, and it was this very trust that left her unguarded when, in the autumn of 1886, the board's books came up short by an amount that would have ruined any ordinary family twice over. Pruitt stood before the town meeting with a grave face, and a ledger he had altered himself, though no one in that room could have known it, and he pointed, with practiced sorrow, at Eleanor Winslow, the widow, for Thomas had been killed the year before when a grain wagon overturned on the river road, the widow who kept the school's accounts and who, Pruitt suggested, had quietly siphoned funds meant for slates and primers and stove coal to cover her husband's debts. It was a lie built on the bones of truth, for Thomas had indeed left debts, and Eleanor had indeed been desperate in the months after his death, and desperation, Pruitt understood, was the easiest thing in the world to make look like guilt. There was no real proof, only suggestion, only the particular cruelty of a respectable man's certainty repeated often enough that it hardened into fact in the minds of neighbors who had known Eleanor for 30 years and somehow believed a stranger over her within a single winter. The board dismissed her from her post before Christmas. She was made to vacate the small teacher's room behind the schoolhouse where she had lived since Thomas's death, and Pruitt, magnanimous in victory, arranged for the debt Thomas had left behind to be called due all at once, forcing her to sell the last of her furniture, her mother's quilts, even the good iron stove her father had built for her wedding, piece by piece, until what remained of a life built across 4 decades fit into a single carpetbag and $11 folded inside a handkerchief. She took a room above the Mercantile that winter, paid for by mending clothes and taking in wash, and she told herself, in the long cold nights, that she had lost her name but not her hands, and that a woman with hands could always begin again somewhere. It was in that state, proud, grieving, and with nothing left to lose, that she heard, in the spring of 1887, that the old schoolhouse itself, the wooden one Pruitt's fine new brick building had replaced 2 years before, was to be sold at county auction, condemned since a storm had torn through its roof and left it unsafe, its bell tower leaning like a tired old man, its windows boarded, its yard gone to thistle. The auction was held on the courthouse steps on a bright, indifferent April morning, and Eleanor stood at the back of the small crowd in her patched coat, while men bid half-heartedly on parcels of grazing land and a broken-down freight wagon. When the auctioneer came at last to the schoolhouse lot, there was laughter before there were even bids, because everyone in Briar's Fork agreed the building was worth nothing but the lumber a man might salvage from its bones. And even that lumber was mostly rotten. Someone called out a joke about selling it to the crows. Eleanor, standing there with her $11, felt something rise in her that she did not entirely understand herself. Not sense, certainly, for sense would have told her to keep her few coins for bread and boots, but something older than sense, something her father had planted in her, as a girl mending harness by lamplight, the conviction that a thing was not worthless simply because a room full of tired men had decided to stop looking at it. When the auctioneer, more out of formality than expectation, asked for an opening bid of $5, Eleanor heard her own voice offer $9 before she had entirely decided to speak, and in the silence that followed, no one bid against her, because no one else wanted it at any price. The gavel came down. The crowd laughed harder this time, openly, and Cyrus Pruitt, who had come to watch the auction of his old rival building with evident satisfaction, laughed loudest of all, calling out that the widow Winslow had found herself a fitting monument. Eleanor walked to the schoolhouse that same afternoon, with a borrowed hammer, and a resolve she could not have explained to anyone who asked. The building was worse up close than it had looked from the road. The roof caved in over the back third of the room, rain-rotted floorboards, soft as bread beneath her boots. The old pot-belly stove rusted through. The desks she herself had once arranged in careful rows, now scattered and split. She began, in that first week, simply clearing debris, dragging broken lumber into the yard, sweeping years of leaves and bird droppings from the floor, and it was on the 3rd day while clearing rubble near the base of the leaning bell tower, that she found the first small clue, a child's slate, remarkably intact, tucked into a gap in the wall where it must have been hidden or lost decades before, and scratched into its frame. In handwriting Eleanor recognized instantly as Agatha Vane's own careful script were the initials A.V., and beneath them a single small etched arrow pointing upward toward the tower. Eleanor stood there a long while with that slate in her hands, remembering the old woman's papery grip in her final hours, the words about the bell tower she had been too grief-stricken to ask about at the time, and she felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, something other than grief moving through her, a curiosity so sharp it was almost hope, though she did not yet dare call it that. The bell tower could only be reached by a narrow ladder built into the schoolhouse wall, a ladder Eleanor had climbed 100 times in her years of ringing the morning bell, and, though the storm had left the tower leaning and the ladder's lower rungs rotted through, she spent 2 days shoring it up with fresh lumber bought on credit from a sympathetic mercantile clerk before she trusted her weight to it. When she finally climbed, in the gray hush of an early morning with mist still lying in the hollows of the valley, she found the great iron bell exactly where it had always hung, dulled with rust but whole, and behind it, wedged into a gap between the bell's mounting and the tower's old timber frame, a copper box no larger than a bread loaf, sealed with wax, gone brittle with age, and wrapped twice over in oilcloth that had somehow, against all the years of weather, kept its contents dry. Eleanor carried the box down with trembling arms, more from disbelief than exertion, and sat with it on the schoolhouse steps in the pale morning light for a long while before she found the courage to break the wax seal. Inside, wrapped in a square of faded blue cloth, she found a leather-bound ledger, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon gone the color of weak tea, and beneath them both, folded carefully in oilcloth of its own, a certificate from the Merchants and Farmers Bank of Helena, dated 1868, made out in the name of Agatha Vane, representing a sum that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat when she finally understood what she was reading. The ledger, in Agatha's own hand, told a story Eleanor had never suspected in all her years beside the old woman. From the very first year she had opened the Briar's Fork School in 1852, Agatha Vane had quietly set aside whatever small surplus remained each term, a few dollars of tuition here, a donation from a grateful rancher there, coins saved by living far more frugally than anyone in town ever guessed, wearing the same 3 dresses for decades, taking her meals plainer than a pauper. And she had sent these modest sums, year after year, to a trusted cousin in Helena to be invested, first in railroad bonds, and later, at her cousin's urging, in a small but steadily productive silver claim near Butte. What had begun as a few dollars a year had compounded, quietly and invisibly, across more than 3 decades, into a sum that by 1887 had grown to something no one in Briar's Fork, least of all Agatha Vane's threadbare reputation, would ever have imagined possible. The letters explained why she had never spent a cent of it, why she had never even told Eleanor, her most trusted pupil and successor. One letter, dated 1861, described how Agatha's own predecessor, the town's very first attempt at a school, run briefly by a man before Agatha's arrival, had been shuttered for 2 full years after a bad harvest left the town unable to pay a teacher's wage, and how Agatha had watched, as a young newcomer, children of 8 and 9 put to work in mines and fields instead, their letters never learned, their arithmetic never begun, and some of them, grown to men and women, unable to read a contract or sign anything but an X for the whole of their lives. She had vowed, reading that history, that so long as she drew breath, Briar's Fork would never again let a drought or a bad winter or a dishonest board close its schoolhouse doors. But she had also written, in a letter dated only a year before her death, of a newer worry, a man of business and easy charm, she named him only as P., who had made unwelcome inquiries about board finances, and who Agatha suspected, with the sharp instinct of a woman who had balanced ledgers her whole life, of intentions that had nothing to do with the children's welfare. Eleanor, reading this in the golden hush of that April morning, understood with a cold clarity that the P in Agatha's letter was very likely kin to Cyrus Pruitt himself, for she remembered now, faintly, whispers from her girlhood of an older Pruitt, a freight agent who had passed briefly through Briar's Fork decades before, and left under some cloud of suspicion regarding a church collection, a man Agatha herself might have quietly thwarted once already. The final letter in the bundle, dated only months before Agatha's death, was addressed to no one in particular, written, Eleanor came to understand, simply so that whoever eventually found it would know her mind. In it, Agatha explained that she had hidden the certificate and her instructions in the bell tower rather than leaving them with a lawyer or the board, because she trusted no institution in Briar's Fork to outlast her own careful watching, and because she believed that whoever climbed that tower to find her promise would be, by the very act of climbing, someone who cared enough about the schoolhouse to deserve it. The certificate was to pass, upon discovery, to whoever held rightful claim to the schoolhouse building itself, on the sole condition that the funds be used to restore and maintain a school in Briar's Fork, open to every child, regardless of a family's ability to pay. It was, in every sense that mattered, an impossible promise. Impossible in its patience, impossible in its secrecy, impossible in the faith it placed in a stranger not yet born to make good on it. And by the plain accident of a $9 auction bid, that stranger was Eleanor Winslow, who now owned, quite legally, the very building the promise named. Word of Eleanor's discovery could not stay quiet in a town the size of Briar's Fork. Not once she carried the certificate to the very bank in Helena, named on its face, and returned 3 days later with a banker's letter confirming both its authenticity and its considerable value, grown now to a sum that could rebuild not only the old schoolhouse but endow its running for a generation. Some in town received the news with the plain, uncomplicated joy of people who had loved Agatha Vane and who saw in Eleanor's discovery a kind of long overdue justice. Others, more cautious, wondered aloud whether a widow so recently disgraced ought to be trusted with such a sum at all, and it was this seam of doubt that Cyrus Pruitt, watching from the shadow of his handsome brick schoolhouse, set about widening with all the patient cruelty of a man protecting far more than pride. Pruitt moved first through the newspaper, a weekly 4-page sheet he partly financed, planting a notice that questioned whether property condemned by the county and sold at auction could legally carry claim to funds of uncertain provenance, and suggesting darkly that the certificate might be forged, or the ledger, a fiction cooked up by a desperate widow to reclaim standing she had lost through her own wrongdoing. He moved next through the board itself, arguing in a hastily called meeting that since the old schoolhouse had once belonged to the district before its sale, any hidden assets discovered within it rightfully belonged to the district, meaning, in practice, to the very board he chaired. And he pressed, with oily reasonableness, for the county to void the auction altogether on a technicality of notice he claimed had not been properly posted. He moved last, and, most dangerously, through whispers dropped at the mercantile and the saloon, reminding anyone who would listen that this was, after all, the same woman once accused of stealing school funds. And wasn't it curious, he asked with practiced innocence, how convenient it was that she now claimed to have found a fortune? Eleanor felt the town's goodwill curling around her in those weeks, the way milk turns in a warm room, slowly, and then all at once. And there were mornings she stood in the ruined schoolhouse yard, certificate locked in a strong box she now carried everywhere out of fear, and wondered whether Agatha's promise had found her only to be stolen from her twice by the same greedy hand. But she was her father's daughter still, and she had spent a lifetime believing that a thing looked at carefully enough would eventually show its true nature. And so, instead of retreating, she began, quietly and methodically, to build her case the way she had once built a lesson plan, with evidence, with patience, and with the stubborn refusal to be rushed. She wrote to the bank in Helena, and obtained not just confirmation of the certificate, but copies of the original deposit records stretching back to 1852, each one initialed by Agatha Vane's own hand, and matched precisely against the ledger Eleanor now possessed, so that no honest eye could call it forgery. She wrote also, on a hunch sparked by Agatha's careful letter, to the county courthouse in the town Pruitt's father had once passed through, and there, after a week of anxious waiting, she received a reply confirming that a freight agent named Josiah Pruitt had indeed been investigated in 1858 for the disappearance of a church-building fund. An investigation quietly dropped when the man left the territory, never to return, a name that matched, unmistakably, the missing father Cyrus Pruitt rarely spoke of. And she went, last of all, to the district's own current financial records, which as a former board employee she still had some right to inspect, and there, comparing supply invoices against actual deliveries with the same careful eye her father had trained on bent nails and cracked axles, she found the shortfall Pruitt had once blamed on her, not gone, as he had claimed, but simply moved, in figures too clumsy to survive real scrutiny, into accounts bearing his own signature. The town meeting was called for the second Sunday in June, ostensibly to settle the question of the auction's validity, and the schoolhouse, Pruitt's fine brick schoolhouse, ironically enough, was packed to its walls with nearly every family in Briar's Fork, drawn by curiosity and unease in equal measure. Pruitt spoke first, as chairman, laying out his case for voiding the sale with the smooth confidence of a man who had never once been made to answer for anything in his life. And when he finished, he turned to Eleanor with a small, satisfied smile, as though certain she had nothing left to offer but wounded pride. Eleanor rose instead, with the copper box's contents laid carefully in a leather folder, and she spoke, not with anger, though anger would have been forgivable, but with the same patient clarity she had once used to walk a slow pupil through a difficult sum. She read aloud from Agatha Vane's ledger, showing the town, many of whose own fathers and grandfathers appeared in its careful columns, exactly how the schoolhouse's modest fortune had been built penny by penny across 35 years of quiet sacrifice. She laid the bank's confirmation letter on the table for any man present to examine, and then, without raising her voice, she laid beside it the courthouse reply concerning Josiah Pruitt, and beside that, the district's own invoices set against Cyrus Pruitt's ledger entries. The discrepancies plain enough now, that even those who had doubted her a month before could see the shape of the truth settling into place, like a key, finally turned in a stubborn lock. There is a particular silence that falls over a room when a town realizes, all at once, that it has believed a lie for the comfort of believing it, and that silence held in the brick schoolhouse for a long moment before it broke into something closer to a low, uneasy murmur. Dozens of neighbors turning to look at Cyrus Pruitt, who found, for the first time since his arrival in Briar's Fork, that his easy smile would not come. He blustered, briefly, about persecution and jealousy, but the numbers on the table did not care for blustering, and within the week the board voted, with only Pruitt himself dissenting, to remove him as chairman and to refer the district's accounts to the county for a full and formal audit, an audit that would, in time, require Pruitt to make restitution of every dollar he had diverted, under threat of prosecution, that sent him quietly from Briar's Fork before the first snow of that year, never to return, much as his own father had vanished from another town 3 decades before, the same blood, it seemed, finding the same end. Eleanor did not celebrate his fall so much as simply set about the work Agatha Vane had entrusted to her. With the certificate's funds released under the bank's oversight, she hired carpenters that very summer to rebuild the schoolhouse's roof and floor, choosing, deliberately, to restore the old wooden frame rather than replace it, keeping the same walls where she had learned her letters as a girl, the same bell tower where a secret had waited patiently for 35 years. She used the endowment not to enrich herself, though she could rightfully have kept every dollar as the schoolhouse's new owner, but to establish exactly what Agatha's letter had asked, a fund ensuring that no child in Briar's Fork would ever again be turned from its doors for want of tuition, a fund that would outlast Eleanor herself, just as Agatha's quiet sacrifice had outlasted her. By autumn the bell rang again each morning at 8, the same bell, newly polished, calling children through the same doorway their parents and grandparents had once passed through. And Eleanor Winslow stood at the front of that restored room once more, not as a disgraced widow scraping by on $11, but as the woman who had proven, in the end, that a promise buried long enough does not die, it only waits for someone, patient enough, to climb toward it. And so we return to where we began, to a woman of 41 with nothing but $11 and a stubborn belief that worth is not always visible at first glance. Eleanor Winslow had been cast out, mocked on courthouse steps, laughed at for spending her last coins on a ruin nobody else wanted, and yet it was precisely because she looked twice at what everyone else had given up on that she found what a dying teacher had trusted the world to eventually deserve. She did not restore the schoolhouse to reclaim her name, though her name was restored in the process. She restored it because somewhere inside her, planted by a blacksmith father and tended by a spinster teacher, lived the conviction that nothing broken is beyond mending, and no child is beyond teaching, and no promise, however long buried, is beyond keeping. That is the story of Eleanor Winslow, and of Agatha Vane, and of a bell tower that held its silence faithfully until the right hands finally climbed high enough to hear it speak. Thank you for spending this time with us, and with Eleanor's story tonight. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things are not always worthless things, and that patience, like Agatha's, has its own quiet way of being rewarded. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something the world had already written off? An old house, an old friendship, an old dream? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where these stories find you. If you enjoyed this journey into Briar's Fork, consider staying a while longer, subscribing for more tales of quiet resilience and hard-won grace from the American frontier, and ringing the bell, so to speak, so you never miss the next one. Until next time, stay close.